everyone. Thank you for joining. So, good day wishes to each and everyone from different parts of the world. I'm Dr. Femina Syed, the Head of Research Institute at UBIS, and joining with me is Dr. Stuart Kewley. And Dr. Stuart needs no introduction. He is the Provost of UBIS, amazing leader, eloquent speaker, and an edupreneur as well. So I welcome Dr. Stuart also, and I formally welcome each and every one of you to our talk of Dr. Stuart Kewley. And Doctor, over to you, Doctor.
Thank you, Dr. Femina. So first of all, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I think I would dispute probably 50%. Really, what I'm doing today is I'd like to talk a little bit about the current situation, global international trade regime. A little bit about my background. Some of you may or may know that I cut my teeth in international trade. So when I was doing my PhD, it was very much kind of trade focused and something that I've been really passionate about for a very long time. I don't claim to be an expert on it. So this really, what I'm going to share with you is really a work in progress. But I've been very fascinated by the current administration of Donald Trump's presidency. So this administration's trade policy, I think it's very kind of easy and almost like a little bit of a cheap shot, if you like, to make fun of this and say it's unpredictable, it's kind of radical, it's nonsensical, and I would dispute that. Actually, I would say that this trade policy that the current US president is conducting is actually based on existing policies that were tried, they were executed in the past, but they really were not successful. And I think that the current presidency, they have learned, they've looked at this in fairly kind of a significant manner, and done a significant deep dive into it, and then really looked at the cost and benefit analysis of the relationship that it has with its trading partners, and has come to kind of a conclusion that's shaped the kind of the strategy that the current administration is actually undertaking. So really what I'd like to do is I'd like to walk you through this. As I say, it's kind of a work in progress, and I will leave quite a little bit of time towards the end for observations, ideas, and thoughts. But the title is this: Globalization, Slowbalisation, and something that I came up with is no-balisation. And what I mean by no-balisation, there's a theory that we're coming to the end of the globalization era, or the era of globalization. Now, that might just be a little bit of that might be a little bit suggestive, but anyway, we'll take a look at that when we come back. But really, what I'd like to talk about is the impact of the Trump presidency on the multilateral trading regime. And one of the things I find that's very interesting with this presidency is that there's a kind of understanding that because it's worked this way for a very long time, it should always work this way. And that's where the Trump presidency has really ripped up the rule book and has kind of re-engaged with the multilateral trading regime, re-engaging with it from the point of a position of power. And we can kind of explore that in more details a little bit later on. Okay, so what am I going to do today? We'll start by looking at the evolution of the global economy. I'll kind of do a deep dive into hyperglobalization, because I believe that this is the period of hyperglobalization in the global economy is really the decade that set in place a lot of dissatisfaction, particularly amongst the loyal voter base that Donald Trump is, the constituency that he had today. And I'll explore why that's the case, not just in the United States, but I would argue that it was the same kind of thing in the United Kingdom as well. And we can look at the figures a little bit. And then I'll try and ascertain what's on the horizon for the global economy in 2025. And if there's anything that is new to you, that anything is startling, please don't hesitate to stop me. So let's take a look at the multilateral trading environment. And I use the term post-war multilateral and trading environment because my perception is this is really when multilateralism really began to come into being. You're probably aware of the foundations of the regulation of international trade. It was by an organization called the General. It's not an organization. It was a set of rules essentially called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and in and around that set of rules, there were a number of institutions that developed. One was the International Monetary Fund. The other one was the World Bank, or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And then there was also the international the international trading kind of environment, really what became later on to become the WTO, the IT organization. The IMF and the IRB came into being as de facto organizations. The ITO never did. And somewhat ironically, the reason that the ITO never came into being was largely because of the United States. The United States realized that by actually joining an organization where you kind of devolve a degree of your responsibility to an international organization in and around the regulation of international trade means that you kind of lose that area of sovereignty or that area of control. So the United States in the and we're talking about the 1950s here, was pretty much against this, which is kind of ironic because ultimately, as we see globalization go on, it was the US, at least the economic philosophy of the US, that began to actually shape international trade policy or the regulation of international trade. Okay, so what was this all about? And it was about peace, to be quite honest. I mean, you've probably heard me reference this in the past, but essentially what the idea was that you've had two catastrophic world wars in the 20th century. And the idea was that if we were to link our trade relations more comprehensively through international bodies, essentially what that would mean is that we would trade more comprehensively with one another. We would liberalize trade more comprehensively, and our trade relationships, our economies, if you like, would become inextricably linked to one another. Therefore, the desire to go down the path of warfare or go down the path of conflict would be eliminated. Now, that has been discredited, obviously, with the war between Russia and Ukraine. And so at least that theory isn't necessarily that logical, but at the end of the Second World War, that was really where we were. It was about developing relationships economically to ensure that we had greater peace amongst the constituent members of these organizations, and the development of the European Union was one of these. So the idea here is the liberalization of global trade, and of course then the beginning of the inextricable link in our economies with one another. And as you can imagine, in these days, it was all about goods, trading goods. And it was pretty kind of small stuff. It was about kind of like, if you kind of reduce your tariffs on imported steel by 10%, we'll do the same. And it was executed through a number of rounds, so the Geneva round, and of course, the Kennedy round, and the Tokyo round, etc. And this is how the liberalization efforts were actually conducted, culminating in the Uruguay round of 1986 to 1994. And this was the big one, and this was the one that really shaped a lot of things. So this is Mike Moore, and he's the first director of the WTO. So at the end of the Uruguay round in 1994, we see the creation of the World Trade Organization. And this is an organization that is designed, this organization is designed to be the regulator of the international markets, the global trading regime. And Moore argues that this organization's trade round is really the most historic. It was very, very difficult. It was 8 years in length. He said it was the most kind of the greatest trade agreement in history. And actually, when you think about which countries benefited directly from this, it was the United States that did pretty well, because it really covered things like, for example, the General Agreement on Trade and Services. So financial services for the first time was under the umbrella of international trade, trade-related intellectual property rights, so Microsoft, etc., anything in relation to branding, that was covered under these trade rules. And then trade-related investment measures. So let's say, for example, you wanted to go and build a factory in China. That investment wouldn't be under the regulation of the Chinese state. It would be under the regulation of the WTO. So really what we're beginning to see here is we're beginning to see the foundations for confidence in recourse in the international trading environment. So if you do have a problem, who are you going to complain to? Well, you'll complain to your own government, which will then go to this our board of arbitration, the WTO, and seek resolution. Now, this also lays the foundation the period of hyperglobalization that then takes place. And there's a couple of, it's a bit like a perfect storm, if you like. There's a couple of things that come together. First and foremost, really by the 1990s, we can see that other economic systems, such as, for example, the command economies of the Soviet Union, they've been discredited to a degree. So they're no longer an alternative. And one could argue that there's only one economic model that is actually viable, and that is the model that is really championed by the United States. It's a liberal market economy. It's the promotion of free trade, not freer trade, and it's about the dismantling of barriers. And we can see this comprehensively across the globe. If you think about Japan, for example, not only we see the kind of dismantling of structural impediments to the Japanese market happen a little bit later, but we also see the kind of dismantling of capital controls, allowing capital to flow pretty freely amongst countries, etc., flowing in as investment into countries and flowing out in terms of rent-seeking opportunities elsewhere. So this is really one thing, the promotion of liberal trade by the adoption of the only economic model that is seen to be viable, and that's the free market economics of the United States. Combine that with the liberalization agenda that we're seeing with the creation of the WTO. In other words, we will support this by ensuring that if the investment goes wrong, or if there's a dispute over intellectual property, or whatever, we will ensure that there's recourse to action and you'll have a solution. So really, this really then lays the foundations to usher in this period of hyperglobalization in the 1990s. And it was supported by other things, really the movement of production out of existing markets into new markets, supported by China coming on board in 1994. So really we begin to see this hyperglobalization supported by China's opening up in the 1990s. It didn't join the WTO until 2001, but we begin to see China opening up and really capitalizing on what its kind of competitive advantage was. And there was two real factors behind Chinese competitiveness. One, on the one hand, there was the cost of its labor. So its labor was ridiculously cheap. And then on the other hand, there was the actual, the cost of its currency. If you combine those two production inputs into the manufacturing process and ensure that that product is then being exported, that product becomes really hyper competitive based on two of those production inputs, low cost labor and a cheap currency. And this is kind of an interesting philosophy. It's an interesting one because it's been used before, particularly in Southeast Asian states. So Japan was the first one to utilize this, and South Korea was the second. China was the third. And I remember giving this this lecture a lecture similar to this to a group of students from East China Normal University in Shanghai, MBA students, and it was a room full of poker faces, basically, because the fact that I was suggesting that China had copied Japan in terms of its actual its kind of economic policy, it went down like a lead balloon, basically. All right. So we see this kind of the development of economic interdependence based on this kind of neoliberal philosophies. I talked about that. And then some of you on the call, for example, Daniel, you know this better than I do, but we can see that extended supply chain, containerization, integrated logistics, this really kind of allows for this kind of shift in production to low-cost manufacturing sites to occur. And if you want to look at the statistics, it looks something like this. So if you can look at the period from, for example, and we can see here, and again, we want to think about trade in goods. If you look at the top graph here, you can see that this is really the period of globalization, starting around about 1993, etc., and moving on to 2010, maybe 2015 in my mind, and that's when we enter into a new era, which we will describe as Slowbalisation. But here's the interesting thing. With this whole idea, we see discontent, and it's kind of natural, right? Because if you're seeing your factory closing down in the Midwest of the United States, and that production then being moved over to somewhere else like China, then people get annoyed with this. So, and there's a couple of things that really begin to support this dissatisfaction. The global financial crisis in 2007, 2008. So if you're old as I am, you'll remember that this was the kind of the meltdown. And again, just to kind of reference some statistics on this. This was the debt crisis, so the mortgage-backed debt crisis, which became pretty endemic, and it spread across the financial sectors, not just in the United States, but elsewhere. And if we look at the kind of statistics in and around this, we begin to see people losing their jobs, but also people losing their homes. So 9 million workers in the United States lose their jobs, 10 million people lose their homes. So I would make the argument, and you probably heard me make this argument before, this is the disenfranchisement of the working class. Right? It's the disenfranchisement of the working class, both in the United States and in Europe and in the United Kingdom to a degree as well. And the point I'm making here is that these are the people that are then going to go on and vote for people like Donald Trump, and they're going to go on and vote for people like Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom, because they have been left behind. They have been disenfranchised. And when we think about the whole process of globalization, there's very little benefit in globalization for them. What does globalization mean to me? It means that I can jet around the world and do nice things, etc. What does globalization mean to them? It means that they're watching their factory being closed down and moved overseas, right? Leaving them with very, very little indeed. So this lays the foundation for the electoral base for the populist leaders that were to follow. And to give you like a statistic on this, so just thinking about what does this look like in terms of statistics? If you look at US manufacturing employment, you can see that 1971 on this graph here, just around about here, I begin 1978, sorry. You can see that, manufacturing employment in the United States peaks at just under 20,000, so 19,000 people around about 1978. And then what you've seen subsequently is you've seen a decline. And then look at this decline going into the period of hyperglobalization from really 1994 into 2010, etc. We can see this significant decline from 19 down to actually by 2010, about 12,000, 11,000, etc. So we're beginning to see these manufacturing jobs actually leave. Okay. And subsequently, we begin to kind of come into this period, and I would argue it's around about 2015. We come into a period of the so-called Slowbalisation, and what are the kind of the drivers of globalization? And again, the beginning is with the financial crisis, 2007, 2008, but then also globalization is compounded by the whole global pandemic. And globalization is really structural, because the pandemic begins to affect, in particular, the whole kind of supply chain, the global supply chain, and I probably referenced this in the past, but my partner at the time, they were running a company in the United Kingdom importing goods from Brazil. And prior to the global pandemic, the actual shipping time of getting those goods from Brazil, importing them from Brazil into the United Kingdom, was about approximately 32 days door to door. When the pandemic hits, of course, that then goes from 32 days to 4 months. And as I mentioned to you in the past as well, we actually, one of the shipments we completely lost. We actually lost control of that shipment because it had been unloaded onto a smaller ship to bring it into a different port due to congestion in the main ports in the United Kingdom. So it had a kind of profound impact on global supply chain. And it kind of pushed the supply chain agenda from being something that was not really discussed at the board level to being kind of critical in terms of risk at the board level discussion, right? And this kind of then began to really create the argument in and around kind of backshoring or reshoring. Is it feasible? Is it possible to actually bring production back? To move it away from these locations, like, for example, production in China, bringing it back into places such as Mexico or Morocco, not into the markets per se, which is kind of interesting. So we're not going to bring it back to a territory that maybe has the same benefits and is actually closer in terms of its location. So, for example, that would be Mexico in close to the US, and it would be countries like maybe Morocco or Turkey, for example, which has a trade agreement with the European Union to serve that European market. All right. Okay. So with the globalization, I would suggest there was kind of both tangible and intangible outcomes from this. The tangible, is supply chain, labor cost appreciation, and also China becomes less attractive as a location of investment by this time because of the cost of labor is rising, and also the cost of the currency has actually appreciated. So those two things that gave China its competitiveness in the 1990s is actually gone. Then we get things like, for example, automation, carbon taxation, particularly in the European market. Getting back to the disenfranchisement of the working class, I would suggest there's also intangible outcomes from globalization. And this is the deepening inequality, which was a byproduct of hyperglobalization. And therefore, the workers that are voting for Brexit in the United Kingdom, who are working for President Trump in the United States, I believe that this is a kind of a byproduct of that. This is these foundations, this disenfranchisement, it was sown a long time ago. All right, these people have been very angry for a very long time. Now, here's the kind of irony. After COVID, we see US manufacturing employment recover to actually levels that were higher than pre-COVID. But I think for the blue-collar workers in the United States, immigration, for blue-collar America, immigration is still an issue. Okay, and maybe for the UK as well. Thinking about the UK, we can see that UK manufacturing sector has experienced significant job losses in recent years. So we're looking at data from about 2010 to 2025, and we're seeing about 200,000 jobs disappearing in this period. Now, if you put this in context, UK manufacturing is pretty small. I mean, in terms of the kind of share of the economy, I don't know what the actual statistics are, but it's under 10%. So we're beginning to see a real decline in manufacturing jobs in the United Kingdom. And the kind of data that we're looking at is showing a sharp contraction. Job loss is accelerating and output declining. Now, one of the arguments that you could make as well, we're moving towards a sector economy, or the UK is a service sector economy. So maybe that is one of the reasons behind that. And you could be right, but what this is suggesting is that this is creating a post-industrial America and a post-industrial UK, right? And therefore, when we see that kind of that angst, we see it as an expression in this. And you've seen this graph before. I know we talked about kind of Brexit in the past, but the blue areas are the areas of the UK that voted to leave the European Union in 2016. And if you look at this kind of area here, this is our industrial heartland. This is Birmingham. These are the big cities, etc. And these are somewhat ironically the parts of the country that are dependent on export markets, but really they're getting into a situation when they're voting to get out of one of the biggest markets that we've ever been part of, and that was the single European market. And the Roundtree Foundation did a kind of an overview of this. And they said that really when they looked at it, it's the poorest households in the UK with incomes of less than £20,000, about $25,000, actually were the ones that tended to vote for leave. The most kind of the more affluent, the more well-educated, the more kind of internationalized households didn't. And it really, when we think about who are these people, they're low-skilled, left behind communities. They're the steel workers, they're the coal workers, they're seeing their industries that have been there for years and years and years just beginning to fall apart. So really, these are the foundations. This is the constituency, if you like, for, I would suggest, Donald Trump in the United States and also Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom. And I would argue that this particularly in the UK case, this is not a vote against the European Union, it's a vote against globalization. And there is an issue in and around migration with this as well. Okay, so that's the kind of basis. That is really my kind of overview of kind of the globalization, slowbalisation. And now I'd like to move into this area of no-balisation, really moving fairly comprehensively away from multilateral trade. Now, I'm going to kind of put something out there, and I'm going to suggest that this could be a temporary measure rather than a permanent one. So does anybody know who the two individuals on the screen are? I think President Trump is pretty easy, right? How about the other gentleman?
Is he not the one who basically lays out the concept of Trump's thinking with regard to trade? I don't know his name.
That's right, Stephen Mirren, absolutely, Daniel, yeah. A very interesting guy. He's an economist, and as Daniel has mentioned, basically what happens is that he looked at the relationship that the United States has with its trading partners, and that relationship, I feel, according to Mirren, is unequal and disjointed. So let's take a look a little bit, and let me kind of maybe paint a scenario, if you like, about how this relationship developed. So we've talked about the post-war period, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with this whole concept of Marshall aid. And Marshall aid, when you look at Marshall aid, which is the aid that the United States gave to countries like Germany, West Germany at the end of the Second War, and also Japan, the aid had two kind of specific objectives. And the amounts were staggering. You're talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars. I wouldn't even imagine what the amounts would be today. But the aid had two specific outcomes. One was to help in the reconstruction process of the economies of these countries. So that was more of a structural dimension. And West Germany, as it was in those days, and Japan typically benefited pretty significantly from that. So the recapitalization and the dollarization of these economies, in the immediate post-war period was very, very comprehensive, allowing West German and Japanese industry to not only reconstitute themselves domestically, but then begin to really think about taking on export markets, which they did very successfully throughout the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s. West Germany, you talk about the miracle years of the 50s in West Germany, okay? The second objective of Marshall Aid was not economic or structural, it was political, in the sense that there was a very significant challenge to, for example, West Germany from the Soviet states and from Japan, from communist China, where you had labor union infiltration by communist elements, and the United States was concerned that, and this is in the 1950s, concerned that Japan would be another domino that would fall in Southeast Asia. So there was foreign policy objectives behind Marshall Aid as well. Now, if we then consider Bretton Woods, and I'm sure you're familiar with Bretton Woods, but it was an arrangement amongst a number of countries, and it was administered by the International Monetary Fund to enhance the stability of international trade in line with the objectives of trade liberalization. This argument that we made about kind of ensuring that our markets are open so we become inextricably linked in our trade agreements. This was about creating stability to facilitate the movement of goods, etc., across the globe by really harmonizing the values of our currencies at a certain level. Now, again, I don't want it to become too boring. I know it's Sunday afternoon. Some of you have just had lunch, I'm sure, and you probably, I know this is, as my ex-wife described my dissertation as bedtime reading for insomniacs. But really, what we're thinking about here is we're thinking about creating a currency board. Now, if you want something that's a classic example of this right now, it's the euro. The euro is a currency board where essentially the currencies agreed to manage their values in relation to a reference currency. Now, the euro went to its logical extreme by abandoning those national currencies and replacing them with a single European currency. But during the Bretton Woods arrangement, the national currencies remained. And essentially what you would do is you would just agree to fix the value of your currency. It's like a bit like a chain against your neighbor's currency, etc. And the reference currency in this arrangement, because we need an anchor, we need a reference currency. In the case of the euro, it's the Deutschmark. In the case of Bretton Woods, it's the US dollar. So again, you have two really interesting things coming out. You have the dollarization of certain parts of the global economy, right? Which then makes the dollar a very attractive tradable currency. And logically, we see particularly trade in commodities are denominated in US dollars. So that's one thing. And then we also see that, the United States dollar becomes the anchor of this arrangement of a fixed currency regime, because the dollar is the only currency that is convertible into gold, hence the name, the gold standard. All right. So really what we're seeing here is a period of importance for the United States, where it sees its own currency become super desirable, and it becomes the currency of international trade. And as part of its initiatives in and around the foreign policy objectives of Marshall Aid, it's prepared to tolerate the trading partners sending volumes of goods into the US market. Does that make sense? So basically what happens is, if you look at the Japanese economy in the 1960s, heavily dependent on things like textiles And of course, there's a textile arrangement. But the United States says, look, here's the deal. Okay, Japan, as part of our commitment to your reintegration into the global economy, we are prepared to accept the fact that you're going to send us large volumes of textiles, manufactured textiles, garments, you know, and the joke that we have is what was the biggest product that Toyota sold to the US military during the Korean War? And everybody will say it was Jeeps, and they'll say, no, it wasn't. It was garments, right? It was uniforms. Why? Because Toyota, that's how it started its production, making sewing machines, essentially. Yeah. So this became precedent. And that precedent is that the United States is willing to tolerate trade surpluses with its partners. In other words, balancing the books is something that is not an option. And there's a range of reasons behind this. As I said, they could be foreign policy objectives, the reintegration of the global economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these trade imbalances really become the norms of trade surpluses. And if you look at Japan, and Edward, I'm sure you know this better than I do, but if you look at Japan in the 1980s, Japan is running a trade surplus with everybody it trades with, including the oil exporting countries, which is pretty phenomenal. And here's the deal. There's a degree of tolerance, particularly by the United States, and then later by the European Union. There's a degree of tolerance to these surpluses. Okay. So I just wanted to set the kind of landscape a little bit for you. So Miran takes a look at this now. So he's been just recently appointed the chairman of the US Council on Economic Advisors, and he takes a look at this situation, and he says, look, I feel that this is not fair to the United States. Yeah. And we really need to rebalance things. But here's the interesting thing. This is not the first time the US has tried this, right? So he comes out with the so-called Mar-a-Lago Accord. It's not an accord, but it was written at Mar-a-Lago, which is one of Trump's properties. And it's really a blueprint for restructuring global trade and monetary relations, while still, and importantly, preserving the role of the dollar as the US's world's reserve currency. Sorry, not the US, the world's reserve currency. And the plans to reduce this surplus, the trade deficit, reshore domestic manufacturing, and kind of realign international economic relationships that were really set at the end of the Second World War. And the kind of mechanisms that are proposed to do this, tariffs, currency and capital measures, and trade agreements tied to national security. Now, again, this is kind of an interesting one, right? Because essentially this had been done in the past. The trade agreement tied to national security in the past was ensuring that Japan didn't become a domino in the 1950s, etc. Right? But now this has changed somewhat in that we, the United States, are underwriting your security, and you need to take more responsibility for paying for this. That's really where we go. And how you pay for it remains to be seen, whether it's, in cash or it's by allowing greater access to your markets for our goods. And even Miran will acknowledge the fact that the Mar-a-Lago Accord, the inspiration is from two things. One is Bretton Woods, so we referenced that, and the other one is the Plaza Accord. But I'm going to add something else. I would say perhaps the blueprint for this was actually this, and it's the Nixon shock of 1971. Okay, again, you may not be too familiar with this, but the Nixon shock of 1971 it's kind of imprinted on the psyche of Japanese business people of a certain age, but it was a very robust America First policy. It was an international policy stance, and it was driven by a range of domestic political pressures. Does that sound familiar? What are the domestic political pressures? So it was linked on the one hand to the Vietnam War and this era of protest, and a lot to do with the actual expense of the Vietnam War, quite significant economic challenges that had built up during the 1960s in and around US productivity. And the fact that the United States was actually, for the first time, beginning to see productivity drop, and its place as the predominant economic power was, I'm not going to say it was being challenged, but was beginning to slip. And if we fast forward from 71 to 81, it was actually slipping then, when actually coming in, and people like Era Vogel, like Japan could be number one. So the idea behind this was that Nixon said, we're going to do a number of things. We need to revalue the dollar. The dollar is overvalued, okay? And that is one of the reasons why US competitiveness is not as good as it could be. So we need to devalue the dollar. And in order to do that, we have to suspend the Bretton Woods Agreement as a currency board, right? So where actual currency values are fixed. So we're going to have to suspend that. And that was the original plan, not to break it, but to suspend it. Yeah. So the kind of outcomes of the Nixon shock were about three. Number one, we're going to devalue the dollar. We're going to utilize tariffs more comprehensively, and we're going to impose 10% tariffs from our trading partners, particularly on manufactured or industrial goods coming into the United States. So here's the kind of the tariff element. And then what we're going to do is we're going to force our trading partners to revalue their currencies, because we think under the Bretton Woods regime, they've had, 30 years of undervalued currency, which, as we mentioned, having an undervalued currency was the basis of Chinese competitive advantage and was the basis of Japanese competitive advantage. Different times, right? So those are the three outcomes: devaluation of the US dollar, revaluation, particularly of the Japanese yen and West German mark, and imposition of tariffs on our trading partners. Here's the irony. The irony is that gold never recovered from this. The Bretton Woods regime just collapsed. The idea was we would reconstitute the Bretton Woods regime with a weaker dollar. It never happened, which for the first time allowed currencies to really, since the end of the Second World War, fluctuate, to float freely against one another, right? So this is the concept of fluctuation. And it kind of had broader implications as well. And I'll talk about those a little bit later on. But I wanted just to kind of give you, move it on again. So by 1985, had the Nixon shock policy, had it actually worked? And the answer is no, right? Because even with those revisions, we can see that Japan was still ramping things up. Japan is running a trade surplus with everybody else. So again, the US goes back to this concept of it's their problem. They have competitive advantage. What mechanisms do we have at our disposal to actually adjust this? And again, the US goes back to the concept of currency revision. And this is the outcome of the Plaza Accord in 1985. And this time it does work. And I'll share just this graph with you here, because I think that this is pretty fascinating. So this is the historical yen-dollar rate. And it's the value of the Japanese yen against the US dollar. Okay. And what I've done is I've divided this into decades, into periods. And I've highlighted the area where there is what we call extraterritorial monetary policy exercised by the United States to Japan. In other words, in simple format, it's forcing the Japanese to revalue their currency. So we look at the first one here. So this is the kind of the Nixon shock in and around here. So we look at the first month of 1971, the yen is trading at 358.02. All right. So that's 358 Japanese yen to $1 US. Fast forward to 1972, to June of that year, and we can see the appreciation of the yen to 303.56. Okay, still, we see the Japanese doing pretty well despite this fact. And we begin to see also that Japan's running a trade surplus with most of its trading, all of its trading partners, including the United States. So Plaza comes in 1985. We can see that in February of 85, the yen is trading it to the US dollar at 260.48. By the end of Plaza, we can see appreciation of 202.79. All right. And again, dissatisfied with the outcomes of this, the Americans bring the Japanese back to the table. And this time, because of a combination of a range of factors, this time this policy actually works. So in the 1990s, we can see that 1994, the Japanese yen is trading at 101 yen 44 to 1 US dollar. Again, intervention by the United States, which means that by 1995 in June, we can see that the Japanese yen has appreciated to 84.64. Japanese car manufacturers are barely profitable around about here. All right. So they need to be around about here. But in June of 95, they're here. And this is one of the reasons why we see the collapse of Japan. It's not the only one. There's internal factors which are pretty important. But I would suggest that the internal factors are an overcompensation against the actual currency revisions suggested by the US in the 1980s. So what does this all mean? All right. So what I'm suggesting is that the policy that the Trump administration is using right now, it has its footprint in the past. So similar principles, if you like, but also I would suggest that the Trump administration is also kind of taking it to the next level, its logical conclusion. Don't forget, in his first period in office, the President Donald Trump tried to utilize tariffs, particularly against China, and they weren't that effective. So really, what are we seeing these days? So currency revaluation, the objectives are the same. All right, so it's the similar ones that we've seen through kind of the Plaza Accord, we've seen the Nixon shock, etc. The reshoring, bringing some work back to the United States, particularly in terms of manufacturing, and you know, tariffs forcing reshoring. You need to come and manufacture in the United States. You know, you guys from China, you can't simply set up a factory in Mexico and circumvent these tariffs by rebadging. You know, it's the last substantial mechanical transformation of your product denotes its origin. You can't simply rebadge as a Mexican product. Okay. Interestingly, the trade deals are now linked to broader security concerns, and this is where the Europeans and when you see Donald Trump suggesting that the Europeans need to pay more for their security, this is the idea behind this. Not just the Europeans, maybe the Japanese as well. You know, you look at the percentage of your GDP you spend on defense and security, and you can see it could be insignificant for some European partners. And then there's other kind of broader security concerns. Defense, we've mentioned, the whole kind of fentanyl crisis with with Canada, and migration. So the question that really, and I'm going to stop talking in a minute because I want to kind of open this up to discussion. You know, will it work? Will this new strategic approach in terms of tariffs, etc., will it work? And the answer is kind of, it's really difficult to say. So tariffs are costly, and you know the backlash on this. You know, who pays for the tariffs? It's the U.S. consumer. So that is one thing. U.S. labor is also costly. And let's think about it. If you're bringing manufacturing back to the United States, it's going to be automated. Edward, you know, you went to the mini factory when you came to Oxford that time. You can see that 70% of the output was automated. It was done by robots. It was only the actual finishing of the vehicles putting in the seats, the dashboards, etc. That was where the humans got involved. So there'll be high levels of automation. So again, is it going to achieve the objectives? And I suppose the question is, I mean, who is your constituency? So really, I believe that, you know, Donald Trump's constituency is those kind of, maybe the disenfranchised guys, those guys that have been disenfranchised of production out of the US, the blue collar workers, etc. So it's an interesting strategy. It remains to be seen if it's actually going to work. And the question that I would like to kind of leave open is, will it work with these guys, with the Chinese? Now, if we do comparative analysis with Japan, the answer is no, it won't. Why? Japan's actual market itself was too small to support the kind of production it was doing. So they were highly dependent on export markets. And secondly, there was constitutional restrictions built in to the Japanese constitution in and around its defense. So there was no permission for the expression of Japanese military power outside the nation of Japan, hence the Japan Self-Defense Force. All right. China is a different case. Right. Now, is China dependent on export markets? Well, absolutely, 100%. Of course it is. But on the other hand, what we're beginning to see is that the market size in China is actually fairly good. It's just maybe the consumption habits of Chinese consumers is fairly low. You know, they like to save rather than to spend. The United States could be the converse of that. And then also, I think the tolerance of the Chinese for this kind of pushback from the US and the Chinese, I mean, the Chinese surplus with the United States is huge. Yeah. And so really, China, you can understand why perhaps China is number one on the Trump administration's list of targets. I'm going to stop there, and I'm just going to, by way of conclusion, so this is a tried and tested strategy, but now the US president has taken it to its extreme. It's radical, and maybe what he's prepared to do is he's prepared to take it to a place that his predecessors were not prepared to take it, for political more than any other reasons. Yeah. My reading of this is that we probably will, you know, are we going to have no-balisation anymore? I don't think so. I think we'll return to slowbalisation, but more kind of regional, more fragmented. We're not going to have the hyperglobalization that we had in the 1990s. And I still suggest that the dollar will remain the currency of choice. I don't believe, let's say, that a BRICS currency, for example, could replace the dollar. But then again, it could be wrong. It has been known. All right. I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to ask you to start. Questions?
Thank you very much, Stuart. That was very interesting. As well, your view on the whole topic. I mean, I think we all think about this day in, day out, what is going to happen, because it is kind of new. Yeah. Just two little things that came up, and it's not necessarily questions, just that reminded me of things when you were talking. In your slide with regard to globalization, whether there were tangible and intangible topics. Yeah. On the tangible side as well, what I saw during my time in supply chains was as well the occurrence of more and more climate change pattern and weather disturbances. So when the black swans slowly became flocks, what it did for me was that, for example, when it came to US supply chains, that I declared certain hot zones where I did not want to have any truck going through or no supplier actually being sourced from, because I knew that over the next 1.5 years, there's the next hurricane going through or the next issue coming up. So as well, that had an impact in terms of us rethinking, resourcing to more local markets to reduce the supply chain just in terms of length. Volatility perspective.
That's interesting.
The The other topic, and this is just something which I just ordered it, is a new book out from Patrick McGee called Apple in China. And what he argues, among other things, is the fact that China would not have happened if, to this extent, it would not have been for Apple. And that in its heights, Apple spent on an annualized basis $55 billion on the development and training of the Chinese workforce, which, if you compare that to a Marshall Plan in Europe, in equal dollars, you would come to something like 25 billion over the whole extension. And Apple spent it on an annualized basis in there, which then impacted as well the rise of the whole industry, which is then interesting to see that now they are shifting to India because Trump would like to get them out, in terms of having an impact eventually as well on China, in terms of, well, there is no training coming any longer from these guys. Just a thought. Will be interesting to see that book.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, because if you think about Marshall Aid, it was about 14 billion, if my memory serves me correctly, you know, and that's, if you're looking at 55 billion, it kind of pales in significance, doesn't it? You know, so that is, that is very, very telling indeed. Well, thank you for those observations. Any other points? Go ahead. Azhar, go ahead.
Thank you for the insights. Just two things. One, I believe, do you think, to what extent the movement of BRICS and to replace the dollar has pushed this agenda? You know, because there's been many discussions over the last 10 years, even Qatar, where I'm based, they signed an agreement with the Chinese to trade in the yuan, basically, and the rial. And also there was a consortium for the gas, you know, in competition with the OPEC to try and change that currency. And India was also toying with the idea of, and India has a bilateral currency agreement with Russia from 1953. So I just want to understand to what extent this threat to the dollar has prompted this strategy. And second question is really related to Bank of International Settlements. Now, at a practitioner level, only 1/3 of the countries of the world are members of this bank, their central banks. And the policies and, if you like, monetary policy and fiscal policy inputs are made by these banks. And globalization and tariffs are also central to their, you know, issues. I just want to understand whether BIS is relevant at a practitioner level and whether it has clout, because, again, you know, I'm just saying that's the second point.
Yeah, I mean, let's go to the second one first of all. I'll struggle to answer that, but I'm more comfortable answering the first one. So basically, when you think about what are the Chinese doing in terms of the utilization of their currency, so they've achieved reserve currency with the IMF. That's one thing. So the RMB is officially a reserve currency. So that's one thing. But you know, it pales again in significance in relation to the actual volume of dollar trades that are actually taking place. The Chinese would like to actually, I believe, increase the volume of RMB trade, and so that's when you're getting into your liquid gas deals. You know, the fact that you are prepared to actually settle that transaction in Chinese RMB rather than in US dollars. So, for example, if you look at what, you know, Brazil makes me laugh because, you know, Luis da Silva, he's like, you know, we have signed this bilateral agreement in terms of currency recognition with China, but what that actually means is that now we're prepared to sell our soybeans and our ore to China in RMB rather than in US dollars. There's no benefit for the Brazilian real. Yeah, so that's that, and I think that really what's happening is that China is utilizing trade settlements to actually broaden the amount, the volume of RMB that's being used. Now, getting back to the BRICS argument, and this is why I'm a little skeptical about BRICS. When you have a currency arrangement like the euro, or like Bretton Woods, the gold standard, you need a reference currency. So, you know, as we talked about before, it was the Deutschmark in the case of the euro, it's the US dollar in the case of Bretton Woods. What's going to be the reserve currency for any BRICS currency? So first and foremost, let's take a look at making the euro. It was horrendously difficult because the actual structure, the economic structure of the European Union, the Northern European states, the Dutch, the Germans, etc., they have very sound monetary policy. They have fairly low interest rates. I mean, Germany, the fact that they had lower interest rates with low unemployment, it's the converse of stagflation. I mean, it's remarkable, to be quite frank. So they have that. But then if you go south, you'll find that countries don't have that. For example, if you look at the Greeks, etc., or if you look at Spanish, higher public debt, more utilization of public spending to support economic development. So trying to pool these diverse economies together and harmonize the value of their currencies, it took them 10 years to do that, and a lot of fudging actually going on to actually then lock the exchange rates together and replace your national currency with a single currency. Imagine doing that in a consortium of economies as diverse as BRICS. And the fundamental question behind that is, who's going to be the reference currency? Who's going to be the anchor currency? Which one? And of course, you know the answer to that already. It's, what the Chinese RMB want to be, but the question that then creates is, will India tolerate having the Chinese RMB as the reference currency behind a BRIC currency? And my feeling with that is probably no. So I feel that it's an interesting idea, but I feel that the political will, the structural capacity, the diversity in terms of the actual values of the currencies are too great to actually create a unified currency. Maybe something a bit looser might work, where, for example, fixing values, but again, it's a hard one. Okay, I am conscious of the fact that I have run out of time, so I do thank you sincerely for giving up your Sunday afternoons to come and attend this. I hope it was useful, and I wish you a very good rest of the day. And if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me about this.